Hello, welcome. My name is Frances Sands. I'm the Curator of Drawings and Books at Sir John Soane's Museum, and I'm going to be delivering a lecture today to accompany our exhibition, Fanciful Figures, People in Architectural Drawings. Fanciful Figures. It's a title that was dreamed up by Louise Stewart, our head of exhibitions, and me over lunch at Pizza Express just around the corner from the museum. And I think it's a good one. Who doesn't like a bit of alliteration? And it's apt because our subject is these figures, which are imagined, not real, and often ornamental. I began the exhibition and its little accompanying publication with the words, "Who are those people?" And I continue, have you ever admired a painting or a drawing, and instead of focusing on the architecture or landscape, you're captivated by the whimsical little figures which populate the scene? The technical term for these figures is staffage, and this exhibition will explore their use and development in British architectural drawings from the 1800s. So these figures, these little added extras, might catch our attention fleetingly, but they're now so commonplace, so familiar, so established in the aesthetic of the art around us that most people take them for granted and don't even give them a second thought, with our roving gaze absorbing them without questioning. But really, indeed, who are these people and why are they there? And how did this recurring feature become so prevalent? Staffage is a term which was adopted in the late 18th century and applies to the small human and animal figures of no specific identity which appear in a painting or drawing. The figures are anonymous. They're certainly not portraits, and they're not the figures one might see in a history painting, which are characters, essential features of a narrative. But rather, staffage figures are a trimming, a garnish to the architecture or the scene around them. They're not essential to the subject matter, but lend a sense of scale, depth, animation, emotion, or embellishment, to the composition. In practical terms, they make architectural drawings more easily understandable, relatable, and alluring, impressing and persuading potential clients of a particular design. A figure might hold an object or be accompanied by a child or an animal. They're usually dressed in aspirational, genteel fashions and are often arranged to indicate the purpose of a building or to emphasize or point to a particular feature or to offer a pleasing, contrasting note of color. Now then. Staffage figures saw increasing popularity in paintings, with 17th century Dutch and French landscape artists such as Nicolas Poussin, an example of his work seen here, and you can see the little staffage figures here of no identity, but really enlivening the scene. It's notable that during the Grand Tour in Italy of an English painter called Henry Stone in the 1630s and 40s, his work incidentally is often compared to that by Poussin, he sketched architectural scenes and included staffage figures within them. Incidentally, Stone's sketchbook, one page from which can be seen here, is actually included in the Fanciful Figures exhibition. At this time, some Dutch landscape painters, including Jan Wijnants, began the convention of employing specialist figure artists to add the best quality staffage figures to their paintings. The concept of including staffage figures in relation to painting specifically was described as early as 1604 in the Flemish writer and artist Karel van Mander by the Flemish writer and artist Karel van Mandler in his famous Schinder Book of Painters, and he described staffage as storykins, which translates as little stories, which I think is rather charming. No. How do I move on? There we are. These conventions continued within fine art into the 18th century and beyond. Indeed, the familiar and much-loved work of artists such as Canaletto, an example of whose work can be seen here, would be far less recognizable without his characteristically heavy use of staffage figures. Just imagine removing the people from this composition, and it would, in my opinion, be far the lesser for it, possibly even falling flat and lifeless. British architectural drawing took a little while to catch up to paintings in the use of staffage figures with their appearance prior to the 18th century being reasonably rare. One very early example can be seen here in the work of the Elizabethan architect John Thorpe. But the figures seen in this image are so badly proportioned in the context of their architectural background, as well as being frankly rather odd in their appearance, that they hardly constitute staffage at all. It occurs to me that they're more of a doodle than an intentional studied inclusion of figures in an architectural composition, and as such I decided not to include this very early example in the exhibition. We do see staffage figures within engraved matter. Here are two examples by Wenceslas Holler from the 1640s, but these images are rather more akin to landscape compositions, albeit architectural in subject matter, and therefore they are the cousins of their contemporary paintings rather than the architectural drawings of the day, and thus the inclusion of staffage figures is unsurprising. Yet all this changed at the end of the 17th century, I believe, with an artist called Leonard Nijff. Nijff was a Dutch painter, and therefore, of course, perfectly familiar with the pre-existing tradition of staffage in paintings. It was as yet uncommon in architectural drawings. Nijff found fame after moving to England in around 1681 and working not as a painter but as an architectural draftsman. He's noted for having popularized the bird's eye view in Britain, and his best known work was a collaboration with his fellow Dutchman Jan Kip. It was a book of engravings entitled Britannia Illustrata, published in 1707-9. This is one plate from that publication, and it depicts significant buildings across Britain, often in bird's eye view, and often including little staffage figures, as you can see here. And thus, the Dutch painterly tradition of including staffage figures within a composition became normalized within architectural compositions. Here, with this drawing of around 1695, also in the exhibition, the architect Sir Christopher Wren commissioned Leonard Nijff to produce a drawing so magnificent as to persuade the Greenwich Hospital commissioners to build this iteration of his design for Greenwich Hospital, despite it not actually fitting their brief. He was trying to pull the wool over their eyes, essentially. Wren was unsuccessful, and Greenwich Hospital ended up taking the form that we know and love today. But this drawing is utterly exquisite, with Nijff's conspicuous use of figures in 17th century dress, indicating that the building would have been an appealing and fashionable place of promenade. The figures and their boats are all fairly comically out of scale, but given the purpose of the drawing, to be alluring to the client, it's likely that the figures were embellishments to a wider campaign, intended to bedazzle the client into acquiescence, rather than being an accurate and scaled composition. The first case in the exhibition offers a timeline of the development of the use of staffage figures in British architectural drawings, starting with that beautiful Leonard Nijff drawing that we've just seen of Greenwich, then moving on a generation to this design by William Kent for an unexecuted riding house at the Royal Mews on Charing Cross. It's datable to the early 1730s. It might not be clear from the drawing how this building was supposed to function, were it not for Kent's charming inclusion of 3 gentlemen horsemen. They've clearly been added later over the top of the lines of the architecture to explain the purpose of the building, as well as to offer scale and animation. Perhaps Kent realized that their inclusion would describe the purpose of the building far more quickly and intuitively than any written inscription ever could. The use of staffage figures was still not typical in architectural drawings at this date, but Kent was a noted and innovative draftsman and added figures far more frequently than his contemporaries. Another generation on, by the middle of the 18th century, the popularity of staffage figures in architectural drawings had grown exponentially, and to the point where their inclusion was more commonplace, even being included in the most casual way in sketch preliminary design drawings. In these 1760s to 70s examples of preliminary sketches by the Scottish architect Robert Adam, one for a pulpit and the other for a mirror frame, we see associational staffage, a vicar in the pulpit delivering a sermon, presumably, and a lady attending to her appearance in the mirror. Each figure elucidates the purpose of the object in question, as well as offering a sense of scale. In both cases, the object is relatively small, given its elaborate ornamentation, and without the figure to offer scale, we might not grasp their diminutive size. Both figures appear to have been added later in light pencil strokes, and in the case of the lady in the mirror, drawn across the scribbled shading behind her. This example is comparable with a roughly scribbled figure that we've just seen. Here we have a record drawing by an unknown architectural draftsman showing the arrangement of Westminster Abbey for the coronation of King George III in 1761. Even in this rather practical record document, the draftsman has included staffage, although you'd be forgiven for struggling to spot it. Here is a detail. This trumpeter can be seen as a tiny additional and entirely unnecessary but charming detail within the drawing. I decided against including this drawing in the Fanciful Figures exhibition as the trumpeter figure is so small. I was worried that people would miss him and struggle to spot him. Robert Adams' contemporary, George Dance the Younger, used staffage figures far less frequently than his colleagues, which is curious, as Dance was a competent amateur figure artist, producing character drawings and portraits for his family and friends. When he did include staffage figures in his architectural drawings, this was done in the most fluid and seamless manner, whereby they no longer appear to have been added, but rather they are integral inner elements of the composition. This example of a Dance office drawing of circa 1771 expresses that fluency, but it also shows the way in which Dance and his office tended to include staffage in a far more practical way rather than for ornamental purposes. This design is quite difficult to understand. The principal subject is the long buff-coloured screen wall with a central Doric portico. The wall provides privacy to an older house behind, coloured in a dull brown. However, this method of head-on, orthogonal depiction offers a limited sense of perspective and depth. And if Dance had not included a horse and carriage, which of course are staffage, it would have been quite difficult to see and understand that the central Doric portico is in fact a porte cochere, a covered entrance wide enough to admit a carriage. Here, the staffage is not included for scale or animation, but is essential to understanding how Dance's proposed design was supposed to work in 3 dimensions. Interestingly, at around the same time as Dance and Adams' work, staffage figures were appearing with similar frequency in architectural publications. Here is the British diplomat William Hamilton's Campi Flegrei, The Flaming Fields, a publication dealing with Vesuvius and its surrounding area. The engraved plates are littered with the figures of British grand tourists who have gathered to marvel at the volcanic, archaeological, and geological wonders of the region. When considering staffage figures, the most crucial architectural publication of this time was James Stewart and Nicholas Rivette's The Antiquities of Athens of 1762, and this is a plate from that publication. It was important for all sorts of reasons, but for our purposes, it was important as it was the first architectural publication which set a standard for ethnographically accurate figures. Previously, the appearance of figures within published depictions of far-flung buildings were generically Eastern or generically Middle Eastern and not ethnographically accurate at all. This image shows this image from the Antiquities of Athens, Volume 2, Chapter 2, Plate 2, shows the Erechtheion on the Acropolis, which I have actually included this in the exhibition. We all know this building, it's incredibly famous, but it was extremely exotic to the British populace of the 1750s and 60s when this book was published, because Greece was under Ottoman rule and rather difficult to get into. A lot of the plates in this publication do include staffage figures, and they are dressed accurately as Greek and Ottoman citizens were at this time. This plate, however, is rather special. It contains a self-portrait of James Stewart, the author, drawing the scene in the bottom right-hand corner. He's seen in Ottoman dress, as was common practice for the few Western travellers that actually made it into that part of the world at the time. We also see a number of individuals who are described in the caption in the book, which reads as follows. The Turkish gentleman smoking a long pipe is the Dizdar Aga, the Ottoman fortress commander. He leans on the shoulder of his son-in-law, Ibrahim Aga, and is looking at our labourers who are digging. The two Turks in the Pandrosium were placed there by him to watch our proceedings and give him an account of our discoveries. The caption then goes on to explain that the girl leading a lamb, who is attended by an unidentified enslaved black girl, is the daughter of Ibrahim, so the granddaughter of the fortress commander, alongside her enslaved companion. And it's worth noting that slavery was commonplace in the Ottoman Empire, and at this time, many enslaved people were brought from Africa as well as elsewhere in Europe. So, at first glance, these figures appear to be staffage, but they are actually portraits of real people whom James Stewart had encountered whilst drawing the scene. They're not staffage at all. And we might argue that the figures themselves are the subject of this engraving and not the Erechtheion behind them. But I wanted to include this plate in the exhibition to show that the line between staffage and not staffage is sometimes very fine and difficult to recognise. Particularly fine examples of 18th century staffage in architectural drawings can be seen in the drawn and engraved work of the noted printmaker, antiquarian and architect Giovanni Battista Piranesi. In 1777, Piranesi surveyed the ancient Greek city of Paestum in southern Italy with its famous Doric temples. His findings were published posthumously in 1778 by his son Francesco as a volume of etchings. This drawing, included in the exhibition, is one of Piranesi's preparatory drawings for the publication. It and its fellow Paestum siblings are unusual, however. Typically, Piranesi made rather Spartan preparatory drawings, feeling that a detailed drawing would undermine the spontaneity of the etching process. But in this case, his Paestum project, the drawings are uncharacteristically detailed, as Piranesi was aware of his failing health and the inevitability of his son Francesco inheriting the project. This is one of 17 surviving preparatory drawings and includes human figures, a dog, and cattle. Piranesi's subjects were nearly always architectural, but he included staffage throughout his career to express emotion, scale, and to highlight particular features. The use of cattle here suggests a somber note, emphasizing that once great buildings had fallen to ruin and are in use as grazing. Interestingly, many of the human figures in the Paestum drawings are taken from a Piranesi sketchbook, an anthology of figures seemingly taken from life, now in the Biblioteca Estense in Moderna. Moreover, the repeated use of similar cattle poses in his Paestum drawings suggests that even the exquisitely talented Piranesi was not adverse to the concept of stock figures, for cattle at least. This design of around 1772 to 74 is a competition design from the office of Robert and James Adam for the rebuilding of Lincoln's Inn, just down the road from the museum. The design was far too large and expensive for the lawyers to build, so it didn't win the competition, but note the profuse inclusion of staffage figures in the drawing. During the 18th century, the area surrounding Lincoln's Inn, particularly Lincoln's Inn Fields itself, was considered to be rather insalubrious. The depiction of women and children enjoying leisure activities in this Adam office drawing, which I've attributed to a draftsman called Joseph Bonomi, suggests that the new architecture would elevate and civilize the area. As we've discovered, staffage figures were customary by this date, and most particularly in topographical views like this, intended to impress a client. It was also around this time that draftsmen appear to have started more regularly using stock figures of their own creation, recycled between their own drawings, just as Piranesi had done. Here we see the corresponding drawing for the other side of Adam's proposed building for Lincoln's Inn, the first showing the side facing Lincoln's Inn Fields, and the second showing the side facing Chancery Lane. The draftsman has included a group of figures surrounding a pair of fighters on the Chancery Lane side. Presumably, it's an organised match, as they first removed much of their clothing and are performing for a crowd. Of course, boxing was a popular pastime in Georgian England. Adam's draftsman appears to have chosen staffage, which offer a counterbalancing moment of informality within an otherwise imposing architectural scene. But let's just compare these two drawings for a moment. On the left of the first drawing is a running dog, which reappears again, albeit no longer piebald, in the corresponding drawing. They're at slightly different angles, but it's clearly the same dog pattern. There's also a woman and child group in the right middle ground of the first drawing, reproduced but turned through 180 degrees in the other drawing. So clearly, these are stock figures of the draftsman's own creation, which he is reusing between drawings. There is also a pair of two reclining ladies in the first drawing, and one of whom actually reappears in an engraved view for the bridge at Syon Park in Adam's publication Works in Architecture, which was at the same date, and likely the preparatory material was by the same draftsman. So you can see that this concept of stock figures is starting to take hold. And I've not undertaken an exhaustive search through the Adam drawings collection for reused figures, but I'm willing to bet that the ones that I've shown today are not the only examples. So this convention for stock figures began a fashion which continues to this day. From the Victorian period, painters and architects could purchase hard copy pattern books of cut and paste staffage figures for their work, just as modern architects today can purchase digital pattern books of staffage for their computer-bound architectural compositions. Although it must be noted that the higher-end practices actually sometimes employ figure artists for this job. As we know from the fabulous video installation considering the use of staffage in contemporary architectural practices, which is displayed in our foil space behind the Apollo Belvedere as a counterpoint to the Fanciful Figures exhibition. By the 1780s, when Sir John Soane established his architectural practice, the use of staffage figures in architectural drawings, particularly in fine presentation and exhibition drawings like this, was extremely common. Indeed, it is in the elegant presentation and exhibition drawings produced by the Soane office that staffage figures are most likely to appear. However, they can be seen in a variety of other types of architectural drawings from the Soane office, and I'll get onto that in a moment. It's probable that Soane himself had learned to include figures in drawings as early as his time as an architectural apprentice in the office of George Dance. Excuse me, George Dance. This drawing is the perfect example of staffage figures from the Soane office. And it's actually my favourite drawing in the exhibition, although ironically it was produced by two men who were not members of the Soane office, but rather freelancers working for Soane on a regular basis. Here we see Pitshanger Manor in Ealing. Excuse me. Soane had purchased Pitshanger in 1800 as his country house. The property held great significance for him, having been the first project on which he had worked, aged 15, in Dance's office. Soane redesigned most of the building, save the dance wing on the left, creating a villa for entertaining guests. This elegant drawing was exhibited at the Royal Academy, where it would have been seen by much of fashionable society, functioning as a sort of self-promotion for Soane, under the eager gaze of many potential patrons. Excuse me. Despite its compact size, Pitzhanger Manor eloquently conveys a sense of grandeur with its classical references, as well as expressing Soane's social status and intellectual and architectural abilities. As with most other fine drawings of Soane's work, Soane employed the architectural draftsman and artist Joseph Michael Gandy. Gandy shows the proposed entrance front of the house before it had actually even been constructed. But the staffage figures here were added by a Dutch specialist figure artist and miniaturist called Benedictus Antonio van Assen. Gandy himself was notoriously skilled in depicting architecture, but was almost equally notorious for his lack of skill in depicting the human form. As such, Van Assen's skills were helpful, and Soane's accounts record regular payments to him between 1800 and 1808 for adding staffage figures to drawings. The payments range from just a few shillings up to £2. He produced the finest staffage figures of any of Soane's office drawings and set a standard for future work after his departure. Figures typically wear genteel fashions at the very sort of height of what was on mode, typically in eye-catching colours. They're often paired, talking to one another, sometimes with one pointing to a feature of the architecture, and often they're accompanied by a child or a dog. Ladies tend to link arms with their partner. Exterior scenes usually use a yellow and black or green and black coupe carriage with red wheels and a red driver's seat, and they're always drawn by one or two bay horses. All of these figure types, which are now familiar to me from a gentle survey of Van Assen's work, were included in this view of Pitzhanger. The colourful figures animate the scene, but also illustrate Pitzhanger's purpose as a place to which Soane could invite guests of distinction. Women's fashion was shifting quickly at this date, and at the start of the 19th century was inspired by classical antiquity, with a high-waisted silhouette and lightweight draping muslin skirt, as seen modelled by the ladies here. The group on the right might be the Soane family themselves, John, Eliza, and their two boys, accompanied by a dog, and with their fashionable guests shown arriving on the left, complete with another little boy, as a playmate for the Soane boys. It looks to me like a seriously smart playdate. Drawings like this set a standard for staffage figures in Soane's office, with Van Assen figure types and group types being imitated for decades. To clarify, Van Assen's figures were not duplicated between Soane office drawings or even copied from Van Assen's work by other draftsmen, but rather it is these patterns of figure types and group types which were then adhered to following Van Assen's departure from Soane's circle and then his death. Van Assen continued to work in London until his death in 1816, and yet there is no evidence that he worked for Soane after 1808. Perhaps the two fell out, or perhaps Soane simply found an alternative among his office apprentices. There are drawings of very high quality with extremely good staffage among work by his apprentices, so that might be a good explanation. Either way, it appears that despite his skill, poor old Van Assen never made a good living from his figures. In Soane's private accounts, there are records of small loans and gifts made to him on top of the payments made for figure drawing. For example, on the 29th of December 1800, quote, lent Van Assen £1, and 31st of March 1808, quote, at the bank, paid Mr. Van Assen 16 shillings, lent him, never to return, £5. In 1815, Van Assen applied for assistance from the Royal Academy, receiving 20 guineas relief and 8 guineas a year. This impecuniousness seems to have been a career-long problem for Van Assen, with or without support from Soane. Long before the two worked together in 1792 to 93, and in an obvious attempt to raise funds, Van Assen produced a series of miniature figure drawings depicting life in London, entitled The Busy Life of London, or London Dissected, as a proposal for publication by subscription. This is one drawing from that proposed publication booklet. The publication never came into being, but the drawings survive at the Soane Museum, suggesting that Soane had purchased them from Van Assen, probably as another rather sort of charitable move. The poor chap was attempting to monetize his skill for figure drawing by making the figures the centerpiece of the composition, as well as an observation of society in London. But alas, it never worked. Another source of income for Van Assen was the production of figure drawings, which were then engraved for publication, usually in newspapers. Here are two such examples from 1816, the year of Van Assen's death. Although the identities of these sitters are unknown, this pair offers a clear view of Van Assen's skill, particularly his subtle depiction of the individuality of each figure and their slightly rumpled clothing. Incidentally, these two are the only two loans in the exhibition at the Soane Museum. Everything else comes from the Soane's own collection. However, they don't hail from too far away, as one belongs to me and another belongs to my brother. They were inherited from a great aunt, and one of them, the one belonging to me, was the inspiration for the exhibition, so I had to include them. Staffage figures appear in such a large number of Soane's office drawings that for the purposes of the Fanciful Figures exhibition, it was necessary to really rein myself in, and I chose to exemplify this material through the case study of drawings made for the Bank of England, Soane's greatest architectural project, which he referred to as the pride and boast of my life, and on which he worked for 45 years. The subject of this drawing, which is by Joseph Michael Gandy, is a ceremonial dinner in one of the bank's great halls. Gandy's purpose is to illustrate Soane's architecture, but this seems secondary to the event taking place, with ranks of gentlemen in their bright red jackets sitting to dinner. This is merely a preparatory sketch for a more finished version. Excuse me, and yet it illustrates what I was telling you about Gandy, his skill with architecture and his lack thereof with the human form. His figures are simplistic, ill-proportioned, and linear. Nonetheless, his figures are rather charming, and I particularly like the man at the end of the near end of the central table, who, as you can see, is turning to us to raise a toast. Here we have another drawing for the bank, the famous Tivoli corner, this time in an unknown office hand, but again with figures added by Van Assen. And here again we have the familiar patterns, the coupe carriages with red wheels and bay horses, the paired figures, often with one explaining the architecture, often linking arms, and often accompanied by a child or a dog. This is yet another Gandy-Van Assen collaboration, showing the interior of the consul's transfer office at the bank. Here we have a variety of staffage figures, but I think of particular interest are a number of figures whom many scholars believe to be Jewish, possibly merchants. A pair in the centre middle ground and another at a clerk's desk in the background. Depicted with beards and tall-brimmed hats, these figures wear garments of a different type to the other staffage figures in the scene. The inclusion of these figures might emphasize the importance of the Bank of England as a national institution catering to all of moneyed British society. Indeed, there is now over a century of scholarship on the subject of members of the Jewish community, a great many of them, in fact, using the Bank of England both as customers and shareholders, so their inclusion here is entirely appropriate. As well as appearing in the most elegant of Soane's office drawings, staffage figures appear to have formed a significant part of Soane's approach to architectural education, both for his own office apprentices and his students at the Royal Academy. We know that he was a prolific architect with a busy office, and from 1784 he took on articled architectural apprentices. Among other responsibilities, the apprentices were tasked with learning to draw, to school themselves in architectural history, and to acquire the expertise needed to construct safe, attractive, and commodious buildings. By this date, the use of figures in architectural drawings was clearly part of their education. Figures permeate the drawings of Soane's office apprentices, including a number of rather charming examples in which the apprentice appears to have included their own likeness, as here. This so-called progress drawing was one of Soane's teaching techniques. He would send his apprentices to his own building sites in order to draw the building construction in progress, not to inform him of progress, but so as to teach the apprentices about the inner structural workings of a building. It's the early days of education in structural engineering. The progress drawings often include fascinating details like Georgian scaffolding, Georgian tools, and of course the carcass of unfinished buildings. This drawing shows the mausoleum at Dulwich Picture Gallery during construction. There's no reason for staffage here, but it's pleasing to see this unknown apprentice's inclusion of himself using a ladder and scaffolding boards as a desk and producing this very drawing. Although this is technically a self-portrait rather than true staffage, it is within that category because we don't know who the apprentice was, and moreover, it's a helpful record of the outfit worn by Soane's apprentices: white trousers, a blue coat, and a black hat. Here too, we have another apprentice's progress drawing, this time within Soane's infirmary at the Royal Hospital at Chelsea. Confirming the fact that construction is underway, 3 builders are included here, carrying their hods and spades and with a terrifyingly high ladder. I'm particularly fond of this drawing, as unlike most other staffage, depicting fashionable people doing fashionable things, here we have labourers undertaking the essential work of putting up a building. It's impossible to know if these figures depict the actual workman labouring in sight of Soane's apprentice, or if they are generic and indicative of the activity taking place. Either way, they are entirely refreshing. And I had to include this drawing in both the exhibition and this lecture. It, of course, shows Stonehenge, and it is our director's favourite drawing in the show. It's also evidence of Soane's character and his dedication to the education of his apprentices. In 1817, at his own expense, Soane sent 3 of his apprentices on a miniature grand tour of Wiltshire. This included visits to various significant architectural sites, including Stonehenge, and then this resulted in a series of magnificent drawings by one of Soane's most capable apprentices, Henry Park. Park depicts himself drawing in the bottom left-hand corner, so this is a self-portrait rather than staffage, but there is true staffage here too. You can see an unknown apprentice in the background. He scaled one of the standing stones with a ladder and is measuring their height with a plumb line. Note too the inclusion of sheep. It seems that, as now, Stonehenge has been used for grazing for some considerable time. And staffage encapsulates both human and animal figures, so these little woolly figures are very definitely pertinent to my discourse for the exhibition. In 1806, Soane was elected as Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy. He composed 12 lectures on the history of architecture, and given that he was teaching during the Napoleonic Wars, when his students couldn't travel, he instructed his office to produce over 1,000 illustrative lecture drawings, large in scale and brightly coloured, so that they could be pinned up at the front of the lecture hall and function much as a PowerPoint does today. Many of the lecture drawings were produced from observation of engravings in the books from Soane's vast library, and any staffage in those engravings were typically copied too. Sometimes these staffage figures were altered, but the regularity of their appearance is notable. As in the engravings before them, the lecture drawings use figures for various reasons, particularly to illustrate the scale or function of a building, or simply to animate the scene. But most pleasing is the use of colour in the lecture drawings, translating the monochromatic engraved figures into a glorious rainbow of diverse ethnicities and modes of attire. I have included a mere 5 examples of Soane's lecture drawings in the Fanciful Figures exhibition. I could have done a show selected entirely from that collection, but I didn't. And this is just on the right here. You see one example included in the exhibition. It shows the interior of the Temple of Jupiter in Split, the city of Split in Croatia. It's now actually that city's cathedral. The lecture drawing on the right, was copied from Robert Adams' book, Ruins of the Palace of the Emperor Diocletian at Spalato in Dalmatia. And you can see that plate on the left. It was published in 1764. Adam had visited Split in 1757 at the end of his grand tour and undertook a survey of the ruins there, publishing his findings for an eager British audience 7 years later. Various plates include staffage figures, usually being a combination of British grand tourists in the genteel mid-18th century fashions that Adam himself would have known and worn, alongside figures purporting to be locals, seemingly added by someone who had not visited Split, as these figures are attired in a fusion of Middle Eastern and Eastern sartorial styles. They are not remotely ethnographically accurate, and we see the cast of characters discussing and pointing to particular features of the building. Amusingly, however, in creating this duplicate lecture drawing, Soane's draftsman updated some of the figures. Instead of the mid-18th century British attire seen in Adams' publication, with breeches and stockings, the draftsman uses his own contemporary Regency fashions with trousers and frock coats. Only the original 18th century draftsman figure in the left-hand corner retains his breeches, presumably in deference to his original artistry. This strikes me as rather significant, as Soane's lecture drawings were intended for an audience of young men, student architects, who were presumably, as many young people are, interested in fashion. And by updating the clothing worn by the figures, the drawing holds even greater appeal to that youthful audience. Staffage in architectural drawings often goes unnoticed. They are typically very small, or they're dismissed merely as a yardstick for scale. However, closer observation of these intriguing little figures can reveal a fascinating and significant subcategory of draftsmanship. It's clear that architects from the late 17th century onwards utilized staffage to the great benefit of their work. Certainly, Soane's employment of Antonio van Assen and his office's later attempts at comparable work illustrates the significance which Soane attached to these little figures. They may be small, but staffage figures evidently made a disproportionate contribution to architectural drawings. Now, before I close, which I will in just a moment, I'd like to note that my colleagues and I have gone to great lengths to make the Fanciful Figures exhibition family-friendly. Ever since I dreamt up the idea of the show during that strange solitude of Christmas 2020, it occurred to me that the subject had the potential to appeal to younger visitors. Who doesn't enjoy a little bit of figure spotting? And so I've included an interpretation specifically for younger children on 10 of the drawings in the show. Where are the sheep? How many people can you see that are wearing red? That sort of thing. There's also a selection of 6 drawings for which we had the children's author Bethany Walker write some very short stories for slightly older children, imagining a narrative for the figures in the drawings. I've written a little trail for children around the museum, looking at staffage in some of the framed works of art. And finally, our wonderful current exhibitions volunteer, Devanshi Rungta, came up with the exciting idea of creating soundscapes for children for 5 of the drawings, which she created herself with voiceovers scripted by her, but slightly embarrassingly read by me. So if you're watching this before the 9th of June 2024, do bring any children or grandchildren and let them explore, because the exhibition is for them too. I brought my son Rufus, who is 5, to see the show earlier this week. You can see him in this picture. And his review was, quote, "Well, mummy, it's boring and good." So a mixed review, but I'll take it as a win. Thank you very much.